It's literally in the last 2 years that I went around most of my life thinking, oh, I had a great childhood. I have loving parents. They're still alive now. And then actually it was my first psychedelic journey. I went into a journey and I came out of that and I'm like, wait a second, I saw my childhood differently. And I saw the imprint that it had made on my brain. And then I start to unwind that. And so the first thing I want to say, and I hope if people are responding to this, is what it does in the explanation of what you just gave is it gives me compassion for myself. Because even in today, I find that I don't always express negative emotions to people because I was taught and in an early age, I was told, you're too emotional, Mindy, just sit down. And so I just learned to shove those emotions down. But and part of me taking my little girl back is literally getting to know who I was as my brain was forming and really spending a lot of time about who I was before all that imprint came in. And you keep bringing up a word that I really want to bring forward because I think it's happening to a lot of women, especially when they go through menopause, and the word is safety. That it's almost like I didn't feel safe as a child, so I came up with a brain pattern, or I developed a brain pattern to feel safe. But then when I all of a sudden went through menopause and the neurochemical armor came down and the new neurons started to form, I realized my old strategies for safety were not ones I wanted to do anymore. And that is happening to so many women. And it left me without a tool. And I didn't, so yeah, I don't know what to do. I mean, I think a lot of women have that aha when they get on the other side, which is why your work is so brilliant. What do we do in that moment?
One of the very first things that we go through in my body of work is helping people redefine safety. And to the brain, safety only means known cause and effect, which I think for many people, this again challenges maybe the paradigm that they've thought around safety, because I do think, especially with the rise of a lot of conversation around nervous system regulation and somatic practices, I've seen the word safety, to at least in my opinion, get kind of weaponized and not used correctly. So to your brain, safety just means known cause and effect, which means that it has to kind of, again, through curiosity, kind of poke and prod and test things in its world. And one of the easiest examples would be to think of a very young child looking at a glass of milk on the table.
Okay.
And they think, I wonder what would happen if I push this glass of milk, right? Maybe the first time they have no idea, right? Because they're just a tiny young scientist. They push the glass of milk over, it spills. But maybe now mom and dad are at the table, and what are they going to do? Oh my God, don't spill the milk. Why would you do that, right? Maybe they're getting some sort of, negative stimulus now. The next time, because a child's not going to stop at one experiment, right? Like no scientist would actually run one experiment and be like, this is officially conclusive. And this is part of why I kind of joke that socio-emotional maturity is paradoxical in nature, because we think that we're getting more mature, but in many ways we actually go the opposite direction. We start off kind of really understanding that we have to be a good scientist and we have to repeat these experiments. Do mom and dad's eyebrows always go up like that? Do I always get yelled at? Do I go to timeout this time, but then that time they laughed about it? What would make me go to timeout this time versus mom and dad laugh about it this time if I did the same thing? So now think for a moment how inconsistent some of our parents were. And that is one of the primary inputs that's going to split somebody onto the left side of the brain pattern spectrum. If your parents are inconsistent with how they are either consequencing or creating structure or a complete lack of structure, it's very likely to push you left. If your parents are very consistent, very structured, which now we can start to see why some of the cultural or religious inputs are going to push people to the right, because they do tend to be much more black and white. Whereas I grew up a Jew on the East Coast, there was not a strong like moral or religious compass at all in my household. Everything was kind of a free-for-all as long as you go to an Ivy League school. That's essentially how I was raised. Like, don't mess around with your grades, be competitive in sports, otherwise whatever. I was riding the subway on my own at very young ages and going to raves into all hours of the night. And I often think back like, really? My parents were just letting me do that in New York by myself? But I digress. I certainly wouldn't be the same, but we learn lessons over the course of generations. So when we look at these sort of parenting inputs that can create instability, we go back to this sort of spilling of the milk experiment, which is something that, you know, whether it's Cheez-It, crackers, or Cheerios, every toddler has some version of this. So maybe now the child has run the experiment once. The first time, mom and dad kind of lunged forward and were like, oh my God, are you okay? Maybe they showed some sort of care and concern. Now, the next time the child's going to look at the milk, they're thinking like, I wonder if mom and dad are going to do the same thing that they did last time. But now that they're looking at the milk, the parents are now thinking like, haven't I already taught you not to spill the milk by way of my last reaction? But the kid's going to go for it anyways, must repeat the experiment. Maybe now this time there's an extra level of shame attached to it. I told you last time not to push the milk. But maybe now they're going to run it 1/3 and final time, just, you know, just to make sure. And this time they lock eyes with their parent. And it's like one of those slow motion movements, and the parents are like, don't you dare. And the kid's like, oh yeah, I'm going to push this milk over. And they're like, don't you do it. Right? Because everyone knows what's about to happen, including the child now. Because now the child is doing it for one last lesson to really understand cause and effect. Now it's more about the parents than the milk. Because the first two times, my parents didn't react the same way. So now this milk is arbitrary. I'm now running this experiment to see, like, can I even trust you people? They're looking, don't you do it, don't you do it. So now this third time I spill, maybe now I actually start to realize, wow, now my parents actually lunged at me, or maybe they grabbed my wrist, or maybe they yanked me off the chair and put me into timeout. What have I really learned here other than my parents are inconsistent with their reactions? Probably honestly nothing. And if you think about how frequently parents are maybe exhausted, or they don't want to uphold that consequence, or this time they're trying to be nice and maybe this time they're tired, those inconsistent inputs in how a child or how a parent is responding to the child, that ultimately is what shapes a child's pattern of safety or not. Because if I know what to expect, then even if what's on the other side is potentially full of shame or it's painful, to some unfortunate degree, you actually trust your parents, even if what's on the other end is abusive, even if what's on the other end is like shame and ridicule. When it's consistent, we can see in the data that the child actually keeps wanting to jump through these hoops, even if that means shame on the other side. When you go to the left, the child actually learns parents can't be trusted. It's every man for himself, and you become hyper independent. But a really interesting factor that I've seen come out of my work is that actually, despite some of the perceived negatives there, these kids actually have the best reported outcomes when they become adults, because you trust yourself, you have drive, you have commitment, you're not waiting for somebody else to show you how to do it. But you had to go through the gauntlet as a child of not really feeling like you could trust your parents to get there.
Yeah. Does the brain like certainty?
Yes.
And if it can't find certainty, it will try to fill in the blanks. Like, that's what I just learned from what you said, is like, how smart of this little kid. By the way, there are moments that I wish I had little kids again. This is one of them. I'll have to do this with my grandchildren someday. But that idea that little children are scientists, that is just brilliant. They're just testing everything to see what life is all about. So if the brain is hardwired for certainty, and I'm living in an uncertain situation, then what I hear you saying is I'm just going to either have to keep testing that situation until I get certainty, or I just peace out. I'll go find my certainty somewhere else.
Okay. So that is what would split you either far left or center left. Some children, if they can't find certainty through testing in their environment, through parental inputs, this is someone that could potentially develop OCD, where if I can't get that repetition from you, I will create my own mechanisms to seek out cause and effect that I can control on my own. So you could see that become OCD. You could see that become pure OCD, where it happens in thoughts only, but not actually through acting out those mechanisms in the physical space. You can also see that come out in anxious attachment. But the center left, which I think is more closely aligned with where you are, and I know for a fact that it's where I am, instead of that, you actually become much more go with the flow, maybe even at times trending on your own chaos, because your brain decides what safety is. Safe, for me to be safe, I have to assume that I can't actually depend on anything and everything can be in flux at all times. So it's not a productive endeavor for me to try to control this. So you actually relinquish control entirely.
Right.
So that
right.
safety to
Yep.
you actually will thrive in chaos. And one of the things that somebody with that pattern has to learn eventually is there are times and places where structure, although it doesn't come naturally to you, is something that if you lean into it, will just further fuel your engine of productivity. But you can either attract chaotic people, which is highly likely, frankly, or you live your life in such a way that you tend more to be that sort of like caricature type B person where like, you know, you've got it all together and you're going to be fine, but your friends, might, I don't know if you've seen any of these type B memes, but I can certainly relate to some of them where it's like the person's in their pajamas, they clearly have just woken up and the girlfriends all show up at the door like, hey, you remember that it's brunch, right? And they're just sitting there like, oh yeah, I'm going to be out in like 1 minute. And they're like, you're not dressed. And to that person, they can literally just change on a dime and like pop on their outfit and leave the door. Whereas everybody else might have taken an hour. They had to, methodically curl their hair, put on their makeup. Maybe even they picked out their outfit the night before. If you grow up in this unstable environment and you don't split to the far left, and you instead split more towards center left, you're much more likely to be so go with the flow that it would drive potentially your type A friends or colleagues absolutely nuts. And they might think that you're just a walking disaster. But you have more skewed positive self-deception. So that's another thing that happens is if you look at the brain pattern spectrum, equal left and right sides, the closer you are to the center on both left and right, you skew more toward positive self-deception. The further you go out to the flanks, the more you're going to skew toward negative self-deception. Negative self-deception is where your brain highlights the risks and really minimizes your ability to see the reward. If you go toward the center, the opposite is true. You focus on the reward and you are able to either go into complete denial over the risks or talk yourself through them that those risks are still worth the reward. And if you think about what we kind of started this little thread with about, I think the statement that I made in the reel was that the lack of self-preservation is actually a trauma response.
Yeah.
And if you think about it in this sort of context, you have to be skewing positive self-deception in order to do that. You have to see that the reward of peace and safety out here is more important than the personal risk to myself. And then if you carry that into any facet of your life, whether it's career or parenting, you're much more likely to overgive, overextend, and even maybe minimize how long something will take because you're so excited about it. You're like, oh yeah, I can knock that out. You're way too quick to say yes to things. But then maybe simultaneously you look at laundry and you're like, I don't have time for that. That's going to take way too long. Right? So there's this sort of manipulation of the concept of time in your mind that's also likely to happen the closer you are to the center of the brain pattern spectrum.
And when you're talking about these brain centers, when you're using right and left, is that just a term unique to your process? Or are you talking about right hemisphere, left hemisphere?
So interestingly enough, it does somewhat map over to left and right hemisphere, though that wasn't the original intention of the brain pattern spectrum itself. I think it might help. I'll kind of explain what qualities would go either up or down that actually build out the spectrum. So we described it as an XY axis. 2 primary patterns on the left, 3 primary on the right. If you start at the center and you kind of notch your way out to the left, there's certain qualities or mechanisms that would actually ratchet up, and then there'd be things that go down. So every step that I take to the left, one of the things that will go up is situational awareness. The more I take that step to the left, the more I'm going to be highly aware of what's happening around me. Another way to look at this would be if you're in dead center, you've got an even balance of situational awareness and relational awareness, but neither one of them is very pronounced, which at times could make you very malleable and possibly a chameleon relationally. And it also could potentially make you look a bit naive in how you walk about your everyday life, right? So another way to say this in kind of more of a colloquial term would be maybe they're lacking street smarts. So as I step out to the left, right, street smarts, for lack of a better word, that's going to go up significantly. Another thing that's going to go up as you step to that left-hand side is hyper-independence. Maybe dead center, you're able to be reasonably linked with another person. You trust them, they trust you, you're able to give and take there. The further you go to the left, that's going to become less and less true. All the way out to the far left side where you might have completely isolated yourself away from other people because now it's not just hyper-independence, it's also a paranoia that you do not trust other people.